Okay, welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast. I am Faris Giacaman. I'm the managing editor of Mondoweiss. And today we have with us Abdaljawad Omar, who is a regular contributor from Mondoweiss. Abdaljawad is a lecturer at Birzeit University and also a PhD student in social studies. Abdaljawad, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Faris. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here. So the reason we have you here is that you wrote an article for us in Mondoweiss last week. The article is titled "The Question of Hamas and the Left." And the main argument of the article is that it basically takes to task the various critiques that have emerged from the Western left over the past few months that have criticized this supposed tendency within the solidarity movement and the American left and the Western left more broadly to sort of celebrate Hamas or celebrate Palestinian resistance. And you sort of take issue with this sort of prominent framing within the solidarity movement, and you sort of kind of break it down into these various parts. So I thought maybe we could start by telling us what are the main arguments of the people who are making this criticism, and then what is your response? What have you written in this piece?
Well, to be honest, there's various articles with various inflection points that problematize the relationship that has been building up with Palestinian resistance as a result of October 7th and the unfolding events afterwards. So many have come to this discussion from different places, and there was a vibrant discussion between, people like Jody Dean and Andreas Malem and others with people also rebutting them. And it's an ongoing conversation about the place, I would say, centrally, of armed resistance and whether the progressive left in the West should support Palestinian armed struggle or should contain themselves in forms of solidarity that excludes, support or outright support for this. And I want to clarify, it's not also just a tactical discussion in a sense that most people are not making an argument that we shouldn't support armed struggle because, it harms the sensibility of Western liberal societies. Therefore, we should appeal through this politics of appeal through a broad-based coalition that would take issue with violence. I mean, their various inflection points their argument includes this idea that armed violence in of itself is problematic.
Right.
Now, many of the articles that I have seen have also used Hamas as a cover for their distaste for armed violence.
For armed struggle, yeah.
So one of the issues that, I took with a lot of these articles is that if you have a position which is that you're against armed violence, then you should just lay it out. However, using the Islamist ideology of Hamas as a way to argue against armed violence seems to me a bit disingenuous. So there is...
And is that basically one of the main arguments that they're saying, that our problem is that Hamas is an Islamist, quote-unquote, socially regressive organization?
Basically, yes, Faris. So many of these articles have this problem with this social regressive force. But the problem with it is that, despite this characterization, what they're actually making an argument against is the violence that Hamas has exercised in the fight with Israel since October 7th and before that. And I think these two issues are being conflated, because if the problem is with armed struggle, then you should lay it out because it also includes progressive forces in Palestine, meaning that, parties like the PFLP and the FLP and others have and continue to use armed struggle in their struggle against colonialism. So if the problem is around this issue, then you should, talk directly to that issue. If the problem is with Hamas's social agenda, its socioeconomic outlook, then that's a different story that needs to be dealt with differently. And I think, it's important that I at least intervene to try and place a Palestinian point of view, try to demarcate what is actually really the contention now in intra-Palestinian politics. And to me and many others in Palestine, even on the progressive left, I think that we see that the main, tension, the main issue is between a politics of defiance and resistance, which Hamas now leads. However, it's not the sole political party that exercises this form of defiance, and a much more, a politics of collaboration with settler colonialism that is being exercised by the Comprador class that rules the West Bank, that had, an attempt or was part of revolutionary attempts in the 70s and 80s, and some of the remnants of those are now basically leading the effort to dismantle the possibility and the capacity of Palestinians to resist in the West Bank. And I think this is the major point of infliction in Palestinian politics that people should at least take to account when they analyze or they want to make an intervention around, what issues or how do we see Palestinian politics? Because if we confine them to this kind of Islamism, secularism, progressive, social regressive, I think we are doing a disservice to one of the primary, elements of the anti-colonial struggle here, which is also a struggle against, the colonial state, and that despite the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which have Islamist orientations, are the one now leading the struggle in many ways, at least on the ground, that's a struggle that has, been going on for 100 years and include different revolutionary subjectivities, etc. So I was just trying to, also correct for that this is the major point of infliction in our society. And by the way, a lot of Islamist forces are also, forces that cooperate with settler colonialism.
Right.
Mansour Abbas is an Islamist, and he's in the Israeli Knesset and backed even coalition that included right-wing elements before the current government in Israel. You have other Islamist parties from the Islamist space that take, a non-confrontational strategy with Israel, like Hizb ut-Tahrir. So this is, again, this is the lens through which we should also view Palestinian politics. Those that, are committed to defiance and resistance, and those that are committed to forms of cooperation for whatever reasons these forms of cooperation arose and are sustained.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about sort of try and unpack that argument. So, there's multiple layers to usually the leftist criticism of the so-called celebration of Hamas. One of them is, as you said, it's a kind of a tactical sort of disagreement that they are against the tactic of armed violence. So what would you, and you're saying that this is not something that is always outright said, but it's kind of like this, they sneak it in through this critique of Hamas. So let's start with that. What would you say to those critiques who say that, well, Palestinians are in an asymmetric relationship with the colonizer? They would be playing on Israel's playing field, which is, a very advanced military. And it seems that all that Palestinians are able to get in return is, more violence because of Israel's brutality. Let's say that's what the argument that they're saying, but they're kind of afraid to say that outright, and so they say, well, Hamas is an aggressive force. So what would you say to that if you weren't to say, well, you're just against armed violence and you're using Hamas as an excuse?
Look, I think it's important here and imperative for everybody to understand that, the idea of using armed resistance is not an ideological choice. It's not simply people, trying or vying or choosing a form of act or action or even a form of struggle, because it emanates from the material conditions of Palestinian life. I mean, resistance is a solution to a predicament. And that's why, for instance, when we trace the evolution from the first intifada to the second intifada, we should realize that part of that shift was not just an ideological choice. It wasn't just people coming in and saying, like, we need to use violence because violence is the only successful way. It was, in fact, spatial segregation between Palestinians and Israelis, the inability of non-cooperation tactics that were prominent in the first intifada to basically become or maintain themselves as effective within this, spatial separateness that was instituted by the Oslo agreements. It was, a mix of the factors that had to do with also the intense Israeli violence used against Palestinian bodies across the occupied territories, the densification of resistance from this kind of power of summoning to, the power of conducting offensive actions. And in fact, Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other political parties have also used a mix and different era of tactics, including nonviolent and, non-armed forms of resistance. It's imperative, at least, that people, when they start grounding the discussion around why armed violence or armed resistance is that it comes from a material necessity of confronting this material, architectural, political regime of control that Israel has instituted in the occupied territories, whether they're in Gaza and the West Bank. Nothing, says that this more than, for instance, the Great March of Return that, in Gaza was initiated by several political movements within the Gaza Strip that was non-armed and was met with severe violence. In fact, I remember and recall, concretely that at the moment of these marches, Trump visited Jerusalem to, recognize that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. 60 Palestinian protesters were killed outright from Israeli snipers, shooting at their legs, maiming them and killing them. The idea that Palestinians choose armed resistance because they enjoy war or take pleasure in it, or, the war in Palestine, the war that Palestinians have.
It's a war of necessity.
It's a war of necessity. It's something that comes out from, fending for yourself. It's a defense of the self against the world. Now, if we start from that point of view, then the world shifts. I think this is the angle shifts in terms of how we actually assess and evaluate, even ethically and morally, these forms of actions.
And it's important to point out, it's not the only option, but is the only option that encompasses within it resistance. There is another option, which is resignation and collaboration.
Yeah, I mean that's the threat. No, I mean it's either you find a way to defy, to break through, to rupture, or you at the end resign yourself to the conditions through which you're thrown in Palestine, which is living under a regime of terror, under a military governance system that can arrest and chooses who to arrest and who not to arrest, chooses who to kill and not to kill, chooses who, to maim and not to maim, and exercises all these forms of violence to maintain you subdued and in servitude. And, of course, like any other people across the globe and throughout history, many Palestinians have chosen forms of resignation, have attempted to interplay with, new forms of identification. As I mentioned in my article, you can only look at people like Joseph Haddad, who's from Nazareth, a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, who now, served in the Israeli army and now is a propagandist for the Israeli state, or somebody like Musab Hassan Youssef, who hails from Ramallah and who's actually the son of the leaders of Hamas, who became a collaborator and, left to the United States and turned to Christianity and now is a propagandist for Israel as well. Or we can look at also people like, the current PA as a form of collaboration. And that's why it's important to situate Palestinian politics along these planes. And through that to make decisions on what forms of alliances can be made with progressive politics. The second thing that I would say, Faris, is that there is an important element to resistance. Resistance in of itself has a progressive element. I mean, it's a form of empowering of the dispossessed. It's a form of mass mobilization. It's a form of organizing people. It's a form of shifting people's consciousness around their conditions and the ability to liberate themselves. In many ways, what does resignation and collaboration mean? It doesn't mean a good life. It means, a slow death. A slow political death. It means that the violence that, becomes more internal. It means that the torture now happens in Palestinian Authority jails. It means alliance with like traditional social structures in the West Bank, for instance, like families and clans, etc. It doesn't mean necessarily, and of course, the introduction of neoliberal consumerism within the Palestinian economic space in the past 20 years, and specifically after the Second Intifada in the West Bank. And it doesn't mean necessarily a better life. It means a life of servitude that allows you or permits you only to think of your intimate life, the life behind closed doors, your family, your friends perhaps, but only to the limited extent. You cannot engage in political discourse, you're not engaged in face-to-face meetings, you're surveilled, you're killed, you're arrested. If you want to actually ask yourself what is to be done or actually think about political possibilities. And that's why resistance itself also holds within it this potential to liberate not only Palestinians materially, but also to shift and create these kind of transformations in their own consciousness. So there is an element to it that is also progressive, even if it's led by, if you want, between quotes, socially aggressive forces, as many of these writers claim.
Yeah, because, essentially, what does it mean to be a progressive or a leftist? It means to liberate humanity. And under colonialism, the main force that is suppressing humanity is colonialism. And so the first order of business is to remove it. Of course, there are other there are other dimensions or elements of human emancipation that are not captured by it. But it would seem to me that if you were to support human emancipation and were to only support one subset of rights, let's say, for instance, gender equality or whatever, but then that you would be for colonialism and collaborating with colonialism, well, I'm not sure in what world that would be considered progressive. And it seems to me...
Well, there are some in the left, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
That there are some in the left, even in the Palestinian left, that will look at Israel and say, well, look, Israel has this modern economy.
Yeah.
Israel has, the high-rise buildings. Israel has, of course, Palestinian laborers are the ones that built it, tragically, built materially Israel as well. But, Israel is bringing new technologies and is bringing this kind of modernization to our society. And on this element, there were many Palestinian leftists, but also leftists generally that say, well, look, maybe colonialism brings some fruits and maybe colonialism is not that bad after all. Now that's an argument.
And would you call those leftists or liberals in Palestine?
Well, some of them were leftists, or at least considered were the part of the communist parties, and that kind of disposition was there, whether in the Communist Party before 48 or even afterwards. In terms of how they viewed Israel, maybe we can look at some sort of benefits coming out of this process and the transformation of our society from this highly peasant rural communities to like a more modernized form of society with new education, etc. I think that one of the elements that are integral to that is that because of that, some people go to say that that's why you should not resist,
Right.
colonialism, that you should accommodate yourself based on this kind of ideology that actually takes progressive, theory, Marxist theory, and tries to apply it, arbitrary into the context of Palestine. I mean, and I've also read and heard a lot of people also in the Western left arguing these arguments about, the Palestinians have choices between servitude or accommodating, the settler colonialism, that they can choose, to resist, but then they will get killed, or they can choose to like live, under the dominion
And
of
they'll
the
be killed
sovereignty.
slowly.
And they will killed slowly, or at least they will reap, some sort of good economic life based on the generosity of this colonial state and what it permits you to do in terms of, laboring and working for the colony. Now, I think that, that disposition exists. I'm not talking about the articles that I mentioned, but that disposition exists historically within even the Palestinian left, not all of it, of course, but also within the Western left. You regressive forms of society, you should be very grateful that, you have this modern state that you can now be slightly part of, although excluded from. And of course, that belies the logic of settler colonialism, which at the end of the day, as we're seeing, almost increasingly, historically as well, whether in the Nakba in terms of the mass ethnic cleansing campaign of the Palestinians, or right now with the rise of this kind of new version of Zionism. It's not a new version necessarily, but as a political force, it's becoming a major political force, which only sees a decisive end in the conflict by a decisive end of Palestinian existence, even on a physical level, meaning that the non-Jew have to be eradicated from the river to the sea. Not only, those Arabs that, hold the Palestinian flag or sing the national anthem or have...
But even the collaborators,
Even the
essentially.
collaborators, yeah.
That is essentially what the position has been of not only of Netanyahu and the right wing, but even of the Israeli center that says there is no role for the Palestinian Authority. And their objection is that the Palestinian Authority is too Palestinian because they are Palestinian in the end, and they can't abide or countenance that presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a crisis among the right wing. I mean, they look at the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority now, in its form of accommodation and cooperation and collaboration with the Israeli security apparatus, in fact permits the deepening of an expansion of illegal settlements without any significant resistance by the Palestinians in the West Bank. It's not really confronting the system. It's incapable and unwilling to do so. And actually, it's enabling it by also preventing the Palestinians from organizing themselves and building the capacity to resist. But they look at the situation and in a very perverse sense, they say, but this is still a form of dependency on Palestinians we don't want, even in collaboration. We don't want to depend on them, even through collaboration. And that's why for them, a figure like Mahmoud Abbas is also a scary figure, to the extent that some Israelis from other political camps look at him and say, well, Mahmoud Abbas is a figure through which we can coexist. And for this right wing, they say, no, we don't have to, we cannot coexist with any form of Palestinian existence between the river and the sea. And Palestinians have, as outlined in, for instance, Mutarich's decisive plan, three options: a life of servitude, to be removed from the land of Palestine through forced immigration or forced displacement and ethnic cleansing, or to be killed if they were killed. Yeah.
Okay.
So these are the three options.
And that to be killed because of resistance. So that being the third option is resistance.
Well, I mean, but that's also like, a highly disingenuous type of, attack. That's one of the mechanisms of power that have always, Faris, existed, is that, and you know this very well because we live in the West Bank, and you know that, if a kid throws a rock at an Israeli Jeep, the Jeep doesn't necessarily arrest the kid. It arrests, the neighbor's house or the house from which that rock was, thrown. Because what they're trying to instill in Palestinians is that, if you throw a rock, then somebody else even gets the punishment. We all deserve the punishment, these forms of collective punishment. And for Israeli fascists, for us, the whole regime is fascist, whether left or right. From our eyes, we don't see a real difference between the different political camps. But in essence, what I'm trying to at least relay is that, they take a moment of resistance, an act of resistance, as a site to reaffirm their own power. Mm-hmm. And that actually creates a lot of confusion, even among the colonized, because they think that it's the resistance that's causing, the onslaught. But it's not. The onslaught is caused by the ideology that thinks that this land needs to be only for Jews. It's an ideology that thinks that this land should exclude the indigenous population of the, embodied in the Palestinian people. It's an ideology that is embedded in these settler logics of elimination and genocide that we're now seeing clearly manifesting in the Gaza Strip. So it's not necessarily, it's not the act of resistance that propels the violence.
No.
But that's one of the techniques of power that, settler colonial logics use.
It's mere Palestinian existence on their land. So this would definitely then support your, let us call it, materialist reading that armed violence or armed struggle has been a result of the nature of the Israeli settler colonial regime, which is, we could use the academic jargon that's been used, that it's eliminationist, because it cannot countenance or abide the existence of non-Jews, essentially, on the land of Palestine. So if we were to accept that, and to accept that, okay, and let's say that now I'm Western leftist, and I'm saying, well, okay, I accept that this is a tactic that you will use. However, there is a significant part of the American left that is uncomfortable with the way in which armed resistance has been employed, whether it's through, whether it's a tactical disagreement, which is to say that the nature, the particular kind of operation that was pursued on October 7 was only going to elicit this kind of genocidal Israeli response. And so they criticize that. And of course, they will seek local Palestinian voices as legitimacy to that. We're not saying this, the Palestinians are saying this. Or because they might have moral qualms about, the targeting of civilians, never mind the atrocity propaganda that has been perpetrated about what happened about October 7th, that there were systematic mass rapes, that there were the 40 beheaded babies. All of these hoaxes have since been debunked. But of course, there is still undeniably, there was a degree to which civilians were indeed killed on October 7th, whether it was as a result of crossfire or is the Hannibal directive. And, these sort of Western leftists are uncomfortable with that. So how would you address that? And of course, one could, of course, say that, well, it doesn't really matter what you think, because the people who are, because you could say that this is, this is just going to happen under colonialism, and it is ahistorical to expect otherwise. So what would you say to that? Would it be along those lines, or would it be somewhat different?
I think the major point, Faris, is that people, when they engage with the resistance, they should start from a place of at least empathy, which means that of belonging. And then whatever you critique you're giving, then it's fine. I mean, you can make arguments for and against. But what the problem with these people, the people that are making that argument, is what they do is the opposite. They find any flaw, whatever the flaw is, and they use that flaw to completely cast away the necessity, the right, and the material condition through which resistance arises, and making these big arguments, immense argument that casts, blinders on the whole phenomena as, one driven, for instance, by anti-Semitism or hate, or, one that is only seeking and yearning for revenge. And I mean, I don't think that, there's no emotional, psychoaffective element to what's happened. There is, of course, but that's one of the problems. Is that my problem is that people do not start this conversation from a place of thinking they belong to the Palestinian predicament, to the Palestinian material situation, and then think through this, think through these moral and ethical questions. They look at any flaw, and then they start making and casting a lot of these judgments. That's the first thing.
So they're already starting from a place of being unsympathetic to the means. Yeah. And it's not simply a question of who are you targeting, or how you. So already we aren't able to proceed in the conversation.
I mean, it's like finding in somebody a flaw to basically cast him and characterize him and mischaracterize that phenomenon. That's how a lot of the approach here is. And of course, I mean, look, historically speaking, Palestinians, have been undergoing a ideological onslaught on them, and a psychic onslaught on them in the sense of, having been characterized as terrorists and terrorist organizations. For instance, Israel, of course, kills 40,000 civilians, but it's still a legitimate army and legitimate state. It uses AI as a form of, as a form to generate targeting, and then targets people in their houses through dumb bombs, but it's still considered a highly sophisticated, liberal, legitimate moral army. These are the things that, where, it becomes disingenuous. I mean, look, if you take all the arguments that Israelis and Zionists make against Hamas, and we invert them, and Hamas uses them against Israel, then, you have a problem. I mean, the Israelis are targeting police in the Gaza Strip. They're targeting civilians in the Gaza Strip based on links of, like, for example, the Who's Daddy AI system that basically allows Israelis to target entire family based on a tenuous connection between one of the family members with an armed movement. Let's assume that that's okay. That's correct. The person is tied to armed movement.
You could say the same about Israeli society. Exactly the same.
Much more, of course, because Israeli society has a people's army, and most of the civilians that were killed in October 7th were civilians that either served or are serving or are reserve soldiers in the Israeli army. Now, I'm not making that argument, but it seems to me the most disingenuous form of attack that is being launched. I mean, in fact, in Palestinian society, the resistance in its armed movement is much smaller as an actual guerrilla force than, the hundreds of thousands of Israelis that go to the army and serve the army in different capacities. It's, the army that serves the economy as a linchpin of the economy. The Israelis that, spend 3 years and 2 years, doing armed services, or the ones that serve in all these different units. So if you're going to make this argument and you're also practicing forms of terror, then what does that make you? Now, I don't want to go into this they are also terrorists, so we are also terrorists type of argument. But what I'm trying to say is that the logic of the arguments that the Zionists are making in constructing these tenuous connections, even in targeting hospitals, can be easily used against them.
Yeah.
Can be easily used against. They're hypocritical, they're immoral, and they have a very big problem in terms of how, not only easy to use, they're actually much more powerful when you place them and actually place them against them, is that their entire society, including their healthcare system, etc., is also part of, the army. A lot of these doctors are also army, reservists. So in many ways, the way they have found, being in power, being backed by the US and imperial centers, found that they can set what are the terrorists and who is not the terrorist, that they can set this frame. And that's what's changing and shifting. And to me, it's surprising that at this moment that many of the world recognize the Palestinian material condition and the problems that they face as a society that is under the severe and actual threat of annihilation and lives within that horizon, defending themselves through the use of armed resistance. Whether we agree with everything that the resistance does or doesn't do is a different question. But at least that, that recognition, you find all these articles, either trying to make, Hamas socially aggressive or, this is a moment where I think, the Maoists have gotten it right in terms of, it's a moment to build a unified front. It's a moment.
The idea of critical support. This is very much a part of the leftist sort of tradition of providing critical support to forces that you don't necessarily align with politically or socially in any given way. However, there is a recognition that in order to defeat an external foe, such as a colonizer, you're going to have to mobilize all of the social and political forces that are geared towards expelling that external foe.
Yeah, and I think that's the role of Palestinian intellectuals today. Especially those in the West, they should explain this to people. They should, explain that history to people. They shouldn't be engaging in arguments that, attempt to deal. I get it from somebody like Amir Haas. Okay, I get it. I'm not saying Amir Haas should be the one, making these arguments, no? But I'm saying that at least Palestinian intellectuals and people who are aware of the material conditions that Palestinians live under, specifically in the Gaza Strip, which has been rendered abject, excluded, besieged, no future or economic, life that is significant, a society that is, under the strains of colonialism that has no mercy and engages in repeated wars. I don't think that, anybody was surprised that, the people of the Gaza and the armed wing in the Gaza would attempt such a breakthrough through the walls that surround the Gaza Strip. Because I think, when Israel refuses to engage politically, if it refuses to negotiate, it says outright to the Palestinians, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. It does not reward those who collaborated with it. So Mahmoud Abbas doesn't get a reward. He builds the institutions of a state, but then he's still, he's corrupt, he's profane, we don't want him, and at the same time we depend on him in terms of security service, and he's not giving a state. And when the world turns away from the Palestinian cause for like the past 10 years and normalization in the region happens, and Biden doesn't even engage at any level, diplomatically or otherwise, with the Palestinian leadership, which the Americans consider their allies in the context of Palestine, like the PA elite. What do you expect? The best argument, and I think this is essential thing for those, who are coming to this new, for the past, the best argument for armed resistance is the fact that Palestinians have even tried collaboration.
Exactly.
They have even tried collaboration, not even defiance or civil disobedience. They've even tried collaboration, and the settler state doesn't seem interested even in that collaboration. So to me, if you're coming at this, trying to just take one element of a larger phenomena that has a long history and then cast, this is just, a ancient hatred of Jews. That's one of the most absurd claims, and it's almost ridiculous because it verges, on total absurdity. If the French came to Palestine and colonized it, are we, gonna, not resist them?
Yeah.
We didn't go to Europe to find anybody to kill. People came here. Whether they think that they have a right to be here or not is a different story. From our perspective, those people came here, took our land, forced us out of this land, and we're defending ourselves and our right to be in this land and to live here in dignity and freedom and liberty and to construct our own society on our own terms. That's simple. to claim that this comes out of hatred for any particular group of people is just ridiculous, because it assumes that Palestinians will be fine with, I don't know, a bunch of Dutch settlers coming here, or a bunch of, I don't know, French or Spanish or whoever comes here, a Christian, Jewish, or even Muslim, whoever it is that comes here. So there's a problem, and it's specifically when that group of people that come here are not planning to live with you. They're planning to actually
Replace you.
So, and from the beginning, I mean, the Zionists in their own doctrines, I mean, anybody that can read them, go to their articles and go to your, to Ze'ev Jabotinsky and what he wrote, go to David Ben Gurion and what he said and wrote and conducted, look at the actual history that a lot of, historians have written about, and you can see clearly that the plan from the outset was to replace the Palestinians. The Palestinians were actually seen as part of, the natural scenery. They're like the animals in Palestine. They have, no voice, no subjectivity, no relationship to the land, through this kind of racialized European superiority complex that, a lot of the European settlers come with. And they would be rendered, excluded and killed. And so what the world expect, that Palestinians will not resist? So to cynically and diabolically use that to manipulate the conversation that because Palestinians resist, and resistance here is both a natural reaction and a symptom of the conditions through which Palestinians live, and an attempt at a solution and escape of that system and structure. So in many ways, you're condemning the symptom before actually looking at the condition through which this symptom has arose. And for me, that's completely absurd and disingenuous. And I think it comes from people who are antagonistic or Zionist, or are, severely manipulated, at least, that they can't see the truth. And I think many of the people that came here, even, when they saw the reality for themselves and they thought honestly with themselves, what would they do if they were here? I mean, the idea of resistance was not distance for them. I mean, you can read the letters of Rachel Corrie or a lot of my friends that came here as well, who, are liberal, etc. But when they saw the reality through which we live, the daily reality, the settlements, the form of violence that Palestinians are under, when they grasp the conditions, I mean, a very, very simple, commonsensical, human reaction to that is that if I was in Palestinian condition, what would have I done? And, I mean, if you want to argue that might equals right, fine. I mean, but that's not really a moral argument. It just means that I'm more powerful, I can kill you, destroy you, and through that killing and destruction, I get whatever I want. Fine. That's like the ground school bully, and you can have that, but that's not a moral and ethical argument. And again, that's one of the responses that we need to go. Again, I think for me, I have no problem people. I mean, I'm not here to say what if I have a problem, but my opinion is that if you're starting from your starting position is one through which you can grasp and understand and empathize with the fact that resistance is necessary, that also armed resistance arises from these kind of material necessity and conditions, and that, the ways and forms of violence that are used are also symptomatic of this larger regime of terror that we live under, and you start to engage critically through that. I mean, fine. I mean, if you have a problem with this tactic or that tactic or this action or what happened here or what happened there, fine. I mean, nobody's comfortable with people being killed. I mean, nobody likes violence. Nobody relishes in violence. I mean, I'm not one to relish in the use of violence. I don't think war is a beautiful thing. I think wars are always horrific. I mean, we can see the price of war now in Gaza as well, how it's unfolding. But it's important to note that you have to start from a position that at least is intellectually genuine when it comes to engagement with both the right and necessity of resistance in the context of Palestine.
So I want to end by bringing us up to the present. So you've presented here an analysis of why armed resistance is a material necessity, and you can't really expect any other kind of response from Palestinians that is not resignation, because it means their total erasure. That being said, armed resistance, and there are many, history is littered with the stories of nations that have resisted and failed and were erased. What do you see are the prospects for the development of resistance and armed resistance in Palestine, in all of Palestine, and not only in Gaza, which has been decimated at this point in time?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, Faris, in terms of, I think that like one of the elements that I spoke to in the article is to talk about resistance as pre-political. And what I meant by that is it doesn't necessarily emanate again from ideologies or culture or, there has been an excessive culturalization. That's another element that I think is important to also touch upon, is that many the left also have a lot of Islamophobia. And part of the reason why they dislike Hamas, it's on this ground of Islamic phobic, tendency that exists among many of the leftists, and also not only in the West, also among some Palestinian leftists. So there's an element of that antagonism. I know I went on an off-ramp, but so it's pre-political. It comes out of material necessity. And we saw signs of it in the West Bank, for instance, and through the atomized actions, or what is called in the counter-terrorist literature,
lone wolf
attacks. We saw that in the forms of, small circles of friends and cells arising and creating, conditions for resistance and resistant actions in the past 10 years, including the creation of these sovereign spaces, or, these places where Palestinians' armed movement had created self-defense zones in the north of the West Bank. Now shifting to another strategy of much more dispersed networks that don't necessarily contain themselves or confine themselves in one specific area. So there is a rise in many of the movements, but I think that we don't live in a very synchronic time among the different geographies in Palestine. Gaza has been able to develop in the past 20 years
an infrastructure
and accumulate power in ways that the West Bank has not. And that is because of the dual system of incarceration and the regime of terror that we live under through the aegis of Mahmoud Abbas's authoritarianism and Israel's military governance in the West Bank, that kill and continue to disable the capacity of resistance to rise in the West Bank, but also through economic pacification by the introduction of neoliberal consumerism in Palestinian society, and various disciplinary and technologies of power that are used to produce new forms of Palestinians that are either too scared to engage in politics or don't want to think about it, or resign themselves to issues that they consider intimate and personal and outside of their ability to control. And politics is one of these areas. I mean, I was telling my friends yesterday that my students, I teach a philosophy course in the university, and my students feel that the course is in of itself violent because it forces them to think, and they don't want to think. And many of the students will tell me is that, why should we think? I mean, we only, we can only live day by day. We can only live, if I want to think, I need, if I think, this means that I have a hope of changing the world, or hope of actually, that critique and deconstructing things will actually lead to something. And for many of the students, they just refuse. It's a joke. It's a refusal to think. It doesn't mean that they don't actually think. They do, but in many ways, that there's that kind of initial rejection to this idea. Let's look at the world and try to critique it and assess it and disentangle it. So to me, Faris, I think that there are possibilities that are rising within the West Bank, but they're still slow. Our society, in the West Bank now, has created this kind of class stratification. There's no middle class social movement that can lead the struggle. The political parties that exist in the West Bank have been largely demobilized, whether in the Islamist or the leftist. Not completely, but in many ways have not been able to rise to the challenge of creating, new possibilities for the creation, both of our movements, but also of social movements that can play a role in producing new leaders and creating new tactics and technologies of resistance and trying to challenge the current reality. But of course, there are always possibilities. But I think what is central, at least now, is that in the context of Gaza, is that we have seen the failure of the other areas and geographies of Palestine to actually rise to the challenge of both supporting Gaza but also defending themselves. Because one of the things that is important is that if Gaza as you said, many people fight, but, at the end, every war, could end up, you can start a war, but you don't know how it ends. And despite the fact that, whatever happened after October 7th has also, enshrined Palestine among a new generation across the world, has, reignited the struggle and re-energized people. There's a lot of, Israel's in a strategic trap. It's incapable of really, conducting a decisive campaign. It's engaging in a war of attrition that is, eating its society from the inside, a form of implosion, but also,
And now there are tensions on northern Palestine with Hezbollah. And
yeah, exactly.
Lebanon.
I mean that war of attrition includes these different fronts, and at the same time, there's the explosion and the implosion, and they're both happening simultaneously. I don't want to exaggerate that. That doesn't mean that Israeli society doesn't have the ability to also, the technologies, the know-how, the military, the diplomatic, and we saw even after 8 months of genocide that some of the countries that are more supportive and vocal of the Palestinians in Europe, for instance, have only chosen thus far, symbolic recognition of the state of Palestine, not actual material consequences to end Israel's impunity, to end Israel's disregard and obscene and perverse transgression of the limits of international law and international norms, and its use of its machine in a genocidal fashion, its military machine in a genocidal fashion in Gaza. There's no end of impunity, and I think this is what is central to us Palestinians also to send to the left across the world is that, nobody's really asking the left to come and struggle, an armed struggle in Palestine. What we're asking you is that you engage in ending Israel's impunity. Israel needs to pay a price diplomatically. It needs to pay a price on a legal level. It needs to pay a price on an economic level. And that only through that pressure coming also from the outside in these forms of, boycott, divestment, sanctions, legal accountability, and arms embargo, and all of the things that Palestinians have listed that could help in shifting the calculus of Israel's leader and Israel's society. Because Israel's society needs to understand that it cannot get away with everything. That its military machine and the military hammer that it uses at every problem is dysfunctional. It's not working. It's not actually getting the results that they thought that they would get. And at the same time, that the world will hold them accountable. That is the way through which a new horizon of possibility can be created in historic Palestine.
Well, that's a really good note to end this on. There's a lot of room for us to keep talking ad nauseum about all of these different issues. So we'd like to definitely have you on again, Abdaljawad, but we'll say bye for now.
Thanks, Faris, for having me.
Thank you.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a non-profit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.